welcome everyone to this evening's panel on Charles Chesnutt, an African-American author during the Jim Crow era. This is hosted by the Lafayette Society and the Fayetteville State Global Studies Lecture Series, which is part of the Department of Intelligence Studies, Geospatial Sciences, Political Science, and History, what was once known as Government History, which was much shorter. But there you have it. The Google search algorithms rule us all. I am, again, Dr. Tabor. I'm an assistant professor of history at Fayetteville State, where I teach African American, world, and Latin American history. I'm a specialist on Haiti. That's enough about me. What we'll be doing tonight is we'll have a brief welcome and from the Lafayette Society, from Dr. Gwen Melton, and then I will introduce our panelists and we will get going. Once again, feel free to drop questions in the chat and we'll do our best to get your questions answered, and we will end promptly at 8 o'clock. And I realize that some people will be joining us from a previous Black History event featuring my colleague Stanley Johnson, which ran from 6 to 7 tonight, and that's great. So this is one of the joys of Zoom, is you don't have to dangerously try to speed across town to go to multiple events in one evening. With that, Gwen, take it away.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and so happy to see so many wonderful faces and interest in this particular lecture series. I'm Gwenesta Melton. I'm a rheumatologist in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and a board member of the Lafayette Society. I just want to briefly share with you what our mission is and why we love to partner with FSU. The Lafayette Society is a nonprofit historical organization that promotes the contributions of the Marquis de Lafayette, which the city is named after. We are particularly proud of his leadership, his opposition to slavery, oppression, and his support of all human rights. And I am particularly enamored with his women's rights efforts, even in his time. With all these attributes and the society trying desperately to connect with our community, we have an FSU endowment. The proceeds of the endowment are to be used for the study of the age of revolution, emancipation, civil rights, in partnership with the FSU Black History Scholars. This is to be used for lectures such as the series we're doing here, field trips, and any other related educational activities. I implore you to be generous and to have the opportunity to give by going to the link at the Lafayette Society website or directly to UNC SFU EDU, where we can give generously to the Lafayette Society endowment on the drop down. Hope you enjoy this series, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Melton. So yes, let me introduce our panelists. I'm just going to introduce everyone up at the top, and then we'll move right into the presentations. So first, we'll be hearing from Dr. Blanche Radford Curry, who received her BA in Philosophy and Religion from Clark College, now Clark Atlanta University, and her PhD in Philosophy from Brown. She served as a professor and administrator in higher education for over 30 years, including retiring from Fayetteville State, where she established FSU's annual celebration of Women's History Month. She's published many articles and book chapters on topics ranging from higher education, racism, African-American studies, Black women, and President Obama. She's contributed substantially to the Fayetteville community, serving as a member and in leadership roles with our local chapter of the Links, of Now, the NCNW, the Rotary Club, Fayetteville Urban Ministry, the YMCA, and the advisory board for the Fayetteville Junior League. We'll next be hearing from Joshua James, who is an English instructor at Fayetteville Technical Community College and holds an MA in Multicultural and Transnational Literatures from East Carolina University, and has done a lot of local research into Charles Chesnutt. And then we'll be hearing from Dr. Maria Orban, who's an associate professor of English at Fayetteville State University. She is the co-editor of Charles W. Chesnutt Reappraised Essays on the first major African-American fiction writer, which was published in 2009. The book received the Sylvia Leon's Render Award for Outstanding Chesnutt Scholarship, presented by the Charles Waddell Chesnutt Association in 2011. Her essay, Charles W. Chesnutt's Letters, The Vaguely Defined Line Where Races Meet, was published in the Edinburgh Companion to 19th Century American Letters and Letter Writing in 2016. And then we'll have a conversation between myself and Nicole Young. Ms. Nicole Young is the archives technician at Charles W. Chesnutt Library of Fayetteville State University, preserving university history for access. She researches local and regional area Black history and assists in community archiving as a part of the mission objective of the archives and special collections. And she's a senior at Fayetteville State, majoring in interdisciplinary studies, and has been a tremendous help to my students in African-American history, where there's a museum on the top floor of the FSU library. So when we can go places again, go to the museum on the top floor, visit the archives, and Nicole can tell you much, much more about the history of Fayetteville State and of Fayetteville, looking at the materials there. Again, as you have questions for the panelists, please put them in the chat and we'll do our best to get to them. And yeah, with that, take it away, Blanche.
Okay, thank you. Thank everyone. And if you will, Ron, put up the flyer, and I've asked him to do that to keep me on target. Many of you who are in education know how quickly we get off track, and that will help me keep pace. Here, I put a photo of Charles Chesnutt. Many of us know about his being very light-skinned, and I think it's important for us to look at that as I look over 5 areas of race as discussed by Chesnutt. And if we notice, we know that most of his writings are platforms for the discussion of racism within these areas. And as I was looking over and putting my strip together here, I did not realize that Charles Chesnutt and I were both born June 20th. And I often have some concerns of that for myself, but I didn't see any of it with him. And just a little brief background about him. He was a student and a teacher at 14 years of age at the Howard School, which he later became principal. And then, as we know, that at that time was called the Howard Normal School, the training school for Black teachers. And he was also a political activist. He was a lawyer, and he was an author. And when we look at race and self-identity in the writings of Chesnutt, Chesnutt was very, very clear about his being 7/8 white. And naturally, he could have passed for Black, but he chose to classify himself as, he could have chosen to pass for white, but chose to classify himself as Black. He was well educated, middle class, and as we say, mixed race, and that mixed race allowed him to possibly pass as white. That was similar to W.E. Du Bois that we learned later that he works with the NAACP, and in particular with writings for the crisis. We know that W. Du Bois had the same history of being mixed race and identified himself very often as a little French, a little Dutch, and Black, but I prefer my Blackness. So they had that in common with one another. When we look at race and politics or race and social issues in Chesnutt's writing, we see his discussing racial intermarriage. We see a discussion of the franchise that Blacks experience. We look at his discussion of convict labor practices for Black. And he also talks about the ramification of passing in a white society. And he talks about the social structure of the superiority of whites. And he talks about the open racism that is almost flaunted. And we see a lot of that in the first, in the novel, The Marrow of the Tradition, where we see white flaunting their racism. And at one period in his life, he becomes so frustrated with the racism that he sees in the South, but does not necessarily experience because of his training, being a professional, being a lawyer, and being the fact that he was often perceived as white. So he didn't encounter that as much, but he was disturbed significantly by it, and he moved from the South, from the Fayetteville area to Cleveland with his wife and children. When we look at the race and political issues for him, they too overlap with the social issues. He talks about Black lynching. He talks about voter suppression. Again, he talks about white supremacists and the Ku Klux Klan. And again, how in his terms, the whites, and he expressed this in particular in The Marrow, that the white people were the problem. Black people were not the problem. And this is very similar to what we found in later years in James Baldwin's 1979 documentary, I Am Not Your Negro, which was the result of a book that was not finished by Baldwin called Remember This House. And in his analysis, Baldwin's analysis of racism in America, he also takes the position that whites are the problem, not Black. And we can discuss that later. And in his race and economic issues, Chesnutt sees that there is a rising middle Black class. There's ownership of business, churches, schools, stores, and lots more. And in his mind, that should elevate Blacks. But we found out later that that too was not sufficient. And when we talk about race and power, what he's talking about there has to do with the fact of opposition by whites to Blacks' ownership, to their gains, to the extent that poll taxes were instituted, to the extent that voter suppression was even enhanced or increased, if you will, by literacy tests that were given only to Black persons, not white person. It was in that time and day, literacy tests were constitutional, but they were not implemented for whites, only Blacks. And that brings me to Chesnutt's dream, reality dream of race, identity, social, political power, and economics. And I like to paraphrase a quote that he gave in The Crisis. And I call this a dream because in the end, for Chesnutt, he wanted a raceless society. And in that raceless society, of course, all of these oppositions, these issues that we see with and associated with being Black would disappear. He says 58 years prior to Martin Luther King's Jr., I have a dream speech. Chesnutt dreamed of a nation, one people molded by the same culture. His dream of the future was a United States of one people with the same culture, same patriotic ideas, with a high regard for citizenship, where people will be recognized for their honor, character, and talents. It was an idea of human liberty and equality set forth in the Declaration of Independence and the Bible, where all people are declared and created equal, an ideal that many worked for. lived and died like William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, Senator Charles Sumner, and President Abraham Lincoln. And we see some of the same words judging us by our character and talents 58 years prior to King's I Have a Dream speech. And then for me, as I look at that, look at his presentation of the issues race related to race, I call that today race identity, social, political power, and economic reality of Chesnutt's writing for America today. We know that many of these issues still remain today. We know also, I think, that Chesnutt's dream in part had to do with the fact that he overlooked diversity and race in terms of race pride. So within his discussion of these issues of race and trying to get beyond them, one may say that he wanted to, as he said, a raceless society. But what does that mean? That means that one does not or should not acknowledge pride in his or her race and all that comes with acknowledging pride in one race. So I see that is problematic with Chesnutt. And lastly, I would say that part of this dream of having a raceless society was Chesnutt's struggle with himself. He could not find a place with Blacks because of his well-defined education and his professionalism. Unlike Du Bois, he did not have a comfort or move easily between those two vineyards, if you will, like many of us as Blacks of my generation have often been able to move between two different vineyards where we might be the only Black in the room, but we can still claim our identity and yet move forward. I think that was a problem with Chesnutt and why he had this dream of a raceless society, which we know in reality is not one that would look like what he has envisioned, where we have to give up our race. We can have a better society, but it should not be one that we have to give up our identity. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Radford Curry. I appreciate the thoughts and the analysis. Yeah, we're now going to hear from Professor James. Who we are having trouble hearing. No, you're unmuted, but the microphone's not taken. Yeah. Try just taking off the headset.
What about now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right. Let me fix this really quickly. Okay. All right. So I'm good, right? You can hear me? Okay. All right. Now I can't hear anything, but that's fine. All right. So that was a really perfect lead-in, actually, to what I wanted to discuss here, especially the what Dr. Curry said about identity and about Chesnutt not being able to figure out where he belonged in American society, this space that he occupies. A lot of that is foundational to his writing, and that's from his life in Fayetteville, which was relatively brief. He left for Ohio, as Dr. Curry said, not long after, he was in his 20s, and it was his journals from 1874 to 1882 that really give us an idea of the author, the man that he was going to become later on in his life. All of those frustrations, the isolation that he feels, not only because of his mixed race, but because of his ambitions. All of those things are so obvious in his journals. And it was his journals that I read first, before I read any of his fiction. So it was interesting to meet him as a child, really, and then a younger man, and then to read his fiction after that. And it was at City Center Gallery and Books, actually, probably in 2011, that I bought his journal, not knowing much else about him. And as I read it, I became really curious about these places in Fayetteville that he was visiting, that he would mention in his journal. And so I was like, okay, I wonder where that is now. And it's got far out of hand as far as the work that I started to do. And I will try to share my screen now. Let's see if that works. Are we good? Okay.
Yes, I can see it.
Okay. So this is a walking tour that I created based on the places that he describes in his journals of Fayetteville. And I'm not going to go over every single stop on the tour, but one important place is George High's bookstore, which is on the market squares, as he calls it in the book. And High would actually go on to own the Fayetteville Observer. He was a white man. And Chesnutt, he never really spent a lot of time at home in his youth, we find out. He was always at the home of his teachers or borrowing books from other people. But George High's bookstore is really interesting because High allowed him to spend a lot of his time there and to debate with him about the issues of race in the South. And High was a strange character because his views on race were by no means progressive, but he seemed to almost enjoy his discussions and debates with Chesnutt. And as I said, it would have been located somewhere where the self-help building is now. But Chesnutt spent a lot of time there, and there are exchanges between him and High, where High is kind of lamenting the loss of what he considered the good blacks who left, either prior to or after the Civil War. He laments the fact that servants just won't do anything that you tell them anymore. And Chesnutt is not afraid to take him on. And you have to remember too that Chesnutt is in his late teens, early 20s as he's doing this. This prominent white citizen in Fayetteville. And it's really High who encourages Chesnutt, if you don't like it here, you may have to just leave. If you don't like the way the South is, you may have to go somewhere else, go north. And of course, ultimately, that's what Chesnutt ends up doing, is leaving Fayetteville, which at the time was a much different place than it is now. Certainly, Fort Bragg did not exist yet. It was after the Civil War, during and toward the end of Reconstruction. It's a much quieter place at that time. But he wanders all over the city. And of course, Dr. Curry mentioned his involvement with the Howard School, which was so instrumental to his education, both as a student and then later as an administrator in his early 20s. But there were also the challenges of figuring out, if you've read The House Behind the Cedars, which is set in Patesville, which is a very thinly veiled stand-in for Fayetteville, the house behind the Cedars, the house itself, the titular home, is based on where Chesnutt lived for a time when he was in Fayetteville. And I became, unfortunately, obsessed with finding the original location, if possible, of this house. And I'm fairly certain that I did. You can never be absolutely sure. And there's a whole lot of rationale if you go to the tour on why I think I found it, looking at deeds and all of these other things. But most likely would have been on C Street in Fayetteville, right near the intersection with Russell Street. There's nothing there right now. It's vacant. They're vacant lots. This is looking west from C Street at the boundary line between two different properties, but most likely that's where it was. But if you want to dig into the nuance and the rationale there, you're more than welcome to do so. But what struck me most about Chesnutt's journals was how lonely he was in Fayetteville. He hardly talked. He doesn't talk at all about his family, really, his father or anyone else. And even after he's married, he mentions his wife and children sometimes, but most of the time it's this loneliness for someone who can share the confusion and the pain that he's feeling as someone who does not, as Dr. Curry says, does not fit in either world, especially in the post-Civil War South. And the closest he comes in Fayetteville actually to really finding someone he can relate to is someone he takes German lessons from at Clarendon House, which was a more or less a hotel that stood where the Fascinate You Museum is now. And it was a young man named Emil Neufeld, who was a Jewish German immigrant to Fayetteville. And he took on Chesnutt as a pupil because if you've studied Chesnutt, you know that he was obsessed with improving himself through learning, that he taught himself languages. And so he wanted to take lessons from Neufeld, and the mayor of Fayetteville at the time even tried to discourage Neufeld from taking Chesnutt on, saying, you're going to lose pupils, you're going to lose income. But Neufeld refused. He said that it didn't matter to him. And it's interesting because Chesnutt says that the people here, some of them at any rate, are prejudiced to Neufeld because he's a foreigner and a Jew. He says that they are so much prejudiced that he would like to hurt them real bad once. I wish he would. Some of these purse-proud aristocrats seem to think they own the whole world. And he says, kind of an ending there, this brief acquaintance, a fellow feeling makes us wondrous kind. And that's the closest he seems to come in Fayetteville to having a real connection with someone who can understand his frustrations and his loneliness, which I don't think he ever was really able to resolve, no matter how successful he was, how prominent he became later on in life. But it all starts here in our fair city. And you're welcome. I'll post the link to this tour in the chat if you'd like to look at it a little bit more. But I'll pass that on back to Dr. Tabor.
Thank you, Professor James. And yes, please do share the link in the chat, as I know I would certainly like to. I mean, I've looked at it, but I'd like to continue to explore it, and that's great. We will now hear from Professor Orban.
Got it. Thank you. What I would like to do tonight is celebrate Charles Chesnutt as Fayetteville's native son, or the closest we've ever come to one, and focus on his successes rather than the obstacles and challenges that he had to overcome, which were significant, but I believe they only made his success more compelling. Author of numerous stories published in newspapers, magazines, a couple of collection of short stories, novels published during his lifetime and posthumously, plays, essays, poems, letters, journals. He was a prolific writer. Although not born in Fayetteville, he spent his formative years here, and those were the years that shaped him as an intellectual and a writer. The people and places that of his youth left an indelible impression on him, and that becomes prominent in his fiction and non-fiction works. He attended the Howard School, a well-funded progressive public institution at the time with very high standards of education. And just like Professor James mentioned, he earned the help and esteem of George Hay, a member of one of Fayetteville's first families who owned a good bookstore and who let him use it, and of his Jewish German teacher, Emil Neufeld. His career took off nicely pretty soon. In November 1818, at age 22, he became the principal of the normal school. According to Alan Chesnutt, in anticipation of his appointment, the board asked Governor Jarvis to increase the salary of the principal to $75 per month, which at the time was significant, because they wanted Chesnutt to remain in Fayetteville and be satisfied. Well, of course, that did not stop him from leaving to try and better his prospects, but the memory of the place stayed with him. One of the main characters in The House Behind the Cedars, and one that many critics believe that it's his alter ego, actually makes this point in the novel. The brain cells never lose the impression of youth. Rena's Fayetteville life was not far enough removed that it have lost its distinctiveness of outline. One of the two, the present, was more of a dream, and the past more vivid reality. Chesnutt got complimented actually at the time, of course, when he wrote the realism was the main literary school. So local color and the accuracy of the description was very important for a successful writer. And as you can see, it was Walter Hines Page, a friend and editor of The Atlantic, one who discussed Chesnutt's progress in his writing and success with him, that makes a point that it was an excellent idea to use the familiar old names, the landmarks, and the friends down there, even if it might cause some tension. That's just proof that it was for real. What I would like to do now is go over a passage from The House Behind the Cedars, which was published by the prestigious Houghton Mifflin Publishing House of Boston, although at the time, usually Black authors would publish their work themselves and then try to market it. Chesnutt didn't want to do that. He wanted a great publisher. He wanted to hit all audiences, and he wanted a great publisher for his book, and he got it. It was a most widely reviewed and read novel by an African-American author in American literary history up to the 1900s. So I would like to take you where he takes us for a walk downtown. Quote, "A 2-minute walk brought Warwick to the market house, the central feature of Patesville, from both the commercial and picturesque points of view. Standing foursquare in the heart of the town at the intersection of the two main streets, a jog at each street corner left around the market house a little public square, which at this hour was well occupied by carts and wagons from the country and empty drays awaiting hire. Warwick was unable to perceive much change in the market house. Perhaps the surface of the red brick, long unpainted, had scaled off a little more here and there. There might have been a slight accretion of the moss and lichen on the shingle roof, but the tall tower with its four-faced clock rose majestically and uncompromisingly as though the land had never been subjugated. The lower story of the market house was open on all four of its sides to the market square. Warwick passed through one of the wide brick arches and traversed the building at a leisurely step. A few rods farther led him past the old brick Presbyterian church with its square tower, embowered in a stately grove. Past the Catholic church with its many crosses and a painted wooden figure of St. James in the recess behind the gable, and past the old Jefferson House, once the leading hotel of the town. The street down which Warwick had come intersected Front Street at a sharp angle in front of the old hotel, forming a sort of flat iron block at the junction known as the Liberty Point. I am sure that you've noticed his stroll downtown Fayetteville is so recognizable that a present-day audience may ask, how come he left out Husky Hardware House on the other way? The novel was certainly a success. In 1930, the New York Times literary critic John Chamberlain stated that, quote, the Negro fiction in America properly commences with Charles Chesnutt, unquote. Chesnutt may not have achieved his dream of becoming a best-selling author, but by the end of his life, he had achieved upper-middle-class status and a prosperous businessman, thanks to his stenography business now. As he remarked in a 1927 letter to W.E.B. Du Bois, quote, for many years I made more money and lived better than any colored man in my city, unquote. Updating his old acquaintance from Fayetteville, Edward G. Lilly, of his circumstances in life a decade earlier, he seems nothing but content with his situation. Quote, I am a member of the Chamber of Commerce, the Cleveland Bar Association, the City Club, and also the very exclusive Rofen Club, membership in which is noted in Who's Who in America and which includes among its members half a dozen millionaires, a former United States Senator, a former ambassador to France, and 3 gentlemen who have been decorated by the French government, unquote. Chesnutt makes references to his ample income on several occasions, and his daughter relates in her biography of Chesnutt. She goes in that biography over their lifestyle and circumstances in detail. How she and her siblings lived a life of privilege, attending elite schools. Actually, Chesnutt's son Edwin went to Harvard. How they went on European tours. As an eager businessman, Chesnutt was invested in the stock market. And when he lost money because of bad advice, he was furious. And to the point of gloating over the larger troubles of the firm he had bought shares in as compensation, arguing that their failure was well-deserved, if only for how much money they had lost him. He explained in 1931 in a letter to his lawyer, Francis Cole, that, quote, Ollis and Company got soaked in the stock slump, to which they contributed so largely. I know I asked one of their men when a certain stock for which I paid $8.50 was selling at $145 if I should sell out. He said no, that he had 3 times as much as I had and was holding on. And I held on. And as a consequence, my stock dropped from $145 to $5, and it's only a few cents above that now. That was only one rotten apple in the barrel. I had 3 or 4 others, which I had bought at their suggestion, unquote. Even during the Depression, the Chesnutts were very well off, living in a big 14-room house in Cleveland with a garage for their car, Chesnutt and his family could also afford to spend 9 weeks of the year at a summer house in Idlewild, Michigan. Whereas Chesnutt wrote to a friend, they, quote, carried a maid with us who made the summer more endurable for Mrs. C. Moreover, being part of the socioeconomic elite was increasingly complemented by literary prestige. Chesnutt himself considered one of the pinnacle of his literary recognition to be the invitation he received in 1905 to join a select group of writers at Mark Twain's 70th birthday dinner at Delmonico's in New York. This invitation caused a lot of excitement in Cleveland, and the Chesnutt household itself buzzed with preparations. Quote, this is from Helen Chesnutt. The dinner, when it came, was an inspiration. The speeches were brilliant, autographs were exchanged, and many complimented Chesnutt on The Coloner's Dream, which had been published only 2 months previously. Every guest was given a plaster bust of Mark Twain, Chesnutt later put his in, quote, a place of honor in his library. And there was quite a bit of gay rivalry in getting the bust inscribed, unquote. Altogether, it was a wonderful occasion, and Chesnutt saw it as a validation of his life's work. Quote, it was very inspiring and something to be long remembered, he writes in a letter at the time. The young lads from Fayetteville, North Carolina, who had filled his letters and journals with their aspirations and hopes, had never dreamed of anything like this. Chesnutt's own turn to be publicly celebrated came in 1928 when he was awarded the Spingarn Medal by the NAACP for his, quote, pioneer work as a literary artist depicting the life of struggle of Americans of Negro descent, unquote. In his acceptance speech, he reaffirmed his earlier literary creed that, quote, one should exalt humanity over race, by emphasizing that, quote again, I tried to write, not primarily as a Negro, writing about Negroes, but as a human being writing about other human beings. And most of my writing ran along the color line, the vaguely defined line where the two races of the country meet, unquote. Chesnutt, whose ambition was to be valued as a writer irrespective of race and who had long felt excluded, was in the end recognized and honored by both races. In 2008, the U.S. Postal Service honored him. Oh, there it is, with a stamp, sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. This is wonderful. I now have some questions for Nicole Young. And if you have questions for the panel, by the way, please place them in the chat. No one has asked any questions yet. And I'm happy to ask questions to the panel, but they might want to hear from you instead. So, but well, first.
Sorry, if I just may, I was so excited by both the previous panelists, and I have to tell Professor James that I went over everything he posted online, and I thoroughly enjoyed his work.
Huh. Wonderful. Wonderful. All right. So, Nicole, some questions for you. First,
yes.
You know, my first time visiting campus after my interview, the first building I ran into was the Chesnutt Library. So, you know, the big campus library is named for him. Chesnutt was on hand for when Governor Zebulon Vance visited the school in 1877. What did he report from that day, from the governor's visit?
From that particular visit, let me share my screen. So here we go. All right. So from this visit, this actually happens several months from the time that the school is officially chartered as the first state-supported public school for Black children, Black youth in the state of North Carolina. And Governor Zebulon Vance actually visits the school 2 times. He visits once in the summer, and then he also visits at the end of the year in December. In it, Chesnutt actually reports on how he's given this tour with his other party in regards to like where certain places had certain things done for them. For example, there was recitations. Recitations were suspended throughout the school, and then the principal himself decided to deliver a short address and to greet him. And then the governor actually is reported to have been giving a speech about, how he was trying to do this out of his dream to get interest in education of all classes of people in North Carolina, which is fascinating because in his speech in January of this same year, he actually kind of echoes that sort of same sentiment. What was also interesting was to see a who's who of people, even some of the students being mentioned, like J.S. Perry. You also had a who's who of African Americans involved in visiting along with the governor, such as Bishop James Walker Hood of the AME Zion Church at Evans. Bishop Hood was also the assistant superintendent of public schools during Reconstruction. He served from 1868 to 1871. So he monitored the schools, including the Howard School of Fayetteville, and he's essentially instrumental in not only the rewriting of the state constitution in 1868, focusing on education, but he's also instrumental in helping the governor select the Howard School of Fayetteville. And so also you had a founder of the university was also available, R.H. Simmons. That stands for Robert H. Simmons. And he was there to talk about things in relation to for popular education. And so it was a very good experience. It was a very good visit for that. And then at the end, you can see him saying, it says, "I am, sir, yours truly, C.W. Chesnutt, assistant teacher, state colored normal school."
I noticed also a few paragraphs from the bottom where the national anthem at the time was "America" or "My Country 'Tis of Thee,"
Yes.
where the Star Spangled Banner wouldn't be adopted for a few more decades. And
Right.
so it's just an interesting, glimpse into the past from all of these old newspapers. Speaking of which, all right, so my next question for you then is Emancipation Day. This is something that often comes up just sort of in passing when discussing the Market House. What was it? What was Chesnutt's involvement in Emancipation Day? So this seems like a very much a Reconstruction era holiday.
Yes. Every first of the year, African Americans would celebrate Emancipation Day, literally usually within the first day of the new year. And this particular demonstration was a very fantastic parade. The route of it actually started around, it was formed over Rand Street and was headed by the Howard Light Infantry and the Rifle Guards of Fayetteville. Oh, and by the way, this one took place in 1880, but I've seen them taking place in Fayetteville from around this time all the way to 1920. So this was a very well heralded and well attended activity for African Americans. M.N. Levy, Major of the 5th Battalion, NC State Guards commanding, and they were followed by the Fire Company No. 1, the Howard, and several other schools, and a large number of citizens. What was interesting about the parade route is that it started from Moran to Hillsborough Street, then
Oh, we've lost audio. Maybe she'll come back. We can't even scroll. Come back, Nicole. I noticed that the national anthem is still the same. This is a long parade, yeah. No, that's okay. As we wait for Nicole to hopefully come back, the joys of Zoom always. Yeah, okay, good to know. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, we'll see if she re-enters. Something that was new to me just initially from just her presentation before we get to the other panelists is that the Emancipation Day events continued, oh, she's back, all the way up to 1920, which is much farther into Jim Crow than I would have suspected myself. So, yes. Nicole, you're back with us?
Yes, I am.
All right,
Okay.
welcome back.
Thank you. And so this parade was well attended, and it included even another founder's brother, Matthew Leary Jr. His brother, John Sinclair Leary, actually provided the speech at that occasion. And so it was a long, passionate speech, but basically it talked about the progress that was currently being made by African Americans then and the goals for the future. And it was really beautiful. So
terrific. There is a question that just initially from the chat of whether there's any connection between the Howard Light Infantry and the Fayetteville Independent Light Infantry, whether they've
I'll definitely need to come back and research, but that is a good question because I was curious to know how did these sorts of military-based color guards and rifle guards act, and when did they get to participate?
Yeah,
but that is a good question.
So when we're thinking about the larger context of this history, we tend to see Reconstruction as lasting sort of traditionally till 1877, though it's not a clear-cut date. Fusion politics, as Reverend Barber discusses, continues in North Carolina for quite a while. And it's not really until the white supremacist redemption campaigns, the so-called redemption campaigns, that we really see Jim Crow taking root. And one of the key moments in that is the Wilmington coup or the Wilmington insurrection of 1898, which also plays a role in Chesnutt's work. So can you tell us more about Chesnutt's response to Wilmington, Fayetteville's connections to the insurrection?
Well, it's interesting to talk about Chesnutt's response to Wilmington because of how he mentions it in the Maryland tradition. What is also interesting to note is that Chesnutt actually had family in Wilmington. This is actually a cousin of his through his young uncle at the time, Dallas Chesnutt Sr. This is Dallas Chesnutt Jr. And this is the family, as you can see.
I got it. Go back. Yeah.
Oh.
Okay. Yeah. Now we can see.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Okay, good. Okay. So this is the family of Chesnutt's family members who decided to move to Wilmington. And this would be Dallas Chesnutt's son and children. But what is also interesting about Chesnutt is that he actually had an instance where he may have perhaps actually met the main instigator of the Wilmington massacre. That would be Alfred Moore Waddell, also known as A.M. Waddell. In this particular newspaper article clipping from May 27th, 1873, so this is around his teenage years, Charles is noted to be preparing to take an examination for the candidacy for the Naval Cadetship Program in Wilmington. And what's interesting to note is that this included the Board of Examiners as selected by Alfred Moore Waddell. Chesnutt is actually kind of pointed out very prominently in this article for being right after this sentence. It says, the latter is a bright mulatto hailing from Fayetteville and is very intelligent. What's also interesting to note is that he's also noted for with a couple of his other peers as being the most proficient in the examination in the English rudiments. So just for all you English majors out there, see? But what's also interesting about Fayetteville is that it is not just kind of standing by and watching the Wilmington massacre. It actually participated in the event as well. In this newspaper clipping from November 17th, 1898, as it discusses the massacre, first it starts off with a summary of the situation, of course, including how Colonel A.M. Waddell and how they tried to, basically were like, the resolutions are about to be followed, no ifs, ands, or buts, including the banishment of the Black editor Alex Manley of the Wilmington Record, where he was given 24 hours to leave and 12 hours of which to notify the committee appointed by the white meeting of his acceptance of a demand that the record printing press be shipped from the city. And what is also interesting about this is that roughly in that same time period, and to the Fayetteville Observer, it talks about the Black people having failed to comply with demands, the businessman, in terms of removing the record by 7:15, with an armed body of 600 white citizens went to the office of that paper to destroy it. But fire, which is said to have been an accident, broke out and consumed the entire building by 8 o'clock. There were 2 whites and 3 Black people who have been reported to be killed at 12:10. Some of them have actually dispersed from the scene, but are trying to congregate in large numbers near the Wilmington Compress. And what's really fascinating also is that with that, at this time at 3:30 p.m. on November 10th, 100 men from Fayetteville arrive at a special train to be sent there at 2 p.m. And so it says large companies of armed men are en route to Wilmington from a number of neighboring towns. And it's just really, really fascinating to see that there was participation from Fayetteville in all this.
It is sobering. On a sort of a higher note, I understand that Charles Chesnutt met Frederick Douglass, or at least was in the proximity of Frederick Douglass.
Yes, actually, the same year that he participated himself in that Emancipation Proclamation Day parade, he was the choir director. He actually went and visited, he actually was recording the speech done by Frederick Douglass in October 1880 of that same year. What's interesting about him recording this speech is the speech that Frederick Douglass gives is called "Why Should the South Be Solidly Democratic?" One of the things, excerpts that I found fascinating was that the true interest, it says, party lines should not run east and west between north and south. The true interest of the country is to have them as our rivers run, winding here and there, holding the whole country together. This is one country. That is what I want to see it. That is what you ought to try to make on it. They do not think the North should be one. It is not solid. Why, when you make yourself solid down here, you give an open invitation to the North to make itself solid. So he's talking about trying to have a sense of unity between the two regions. And that's really fascinating to see Frederick Douglass talking about that. He also says, and let me try to zoom in on it if I can. He said, well then, why are you solid? What are you going to do? To take away the 14th and 15th Amendments? He's referring to the Reconstruction Act amendments. Is that what you are solid for? I don't believe that. General Hancock says you shan't. He is going to enforce every amendment of the Constitution sacredly as any other part. Well then, why are you solid? Is it because you want free trade? No, I don't believe that story. What is it? Because you want a different currency? No, nobody wants a different currency. You don't want to go back to the old state bank system when we had to buy a bank detector every 2 weeks and not take a note, even from our grandpappies, without looking into the detector to see how much discount there was on it. You have $1 now, and that is $1 everywhere. So then why are you solid against other parts of the country? I do not believe you can tell me. You have no reason. It is an undefinable something that leads you to desire the South solid, but there is no political principle in it. It is only a vague, dumb admiration of an idea or sentiment. There is nothing tangible about it. And to see that this conversation that he's having during his speech, it similarly echoes over 140 years later with how we're talking about politics today, and how we navigate that in our southern region is really fascinating. And so I think a lot about Chesnutt. I think about how he engaged a lot of the men and women of his time, and how a lot of that mirrors to today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mhm.
And there's a note in the chat from Dr. Walsh that according to local historian Bruce Dawes, the Howard Light Infantry was a formal militia company in town formed around 1876.
Oh,
And
okay.
so it'd be interesting to know what happened to it as the decades wore on. But yeah, and the Fayetteville Light Infantry, of course, was formed in the 1790s, right? 1793 or something like that. So yeah, it's been wonderful. I'm going to give each of our panelists just one last chance to say something before we head on out, if they want. Let's start with Dr. Radford Curry, if she. If I can mute, oh, there we go. Maybe I need to. You're still muted, Blanche. There we
Sorry
go.
about that. Okay. I wanted to thank everybody for attending, and I also appreciate how much more I learned about Chesnutt from our other two panelists. I thoroughly enjoyed the walk through Fayetteville and the celebration by Dr. Maria Arbin. Thank you.
Thank you, Blanche. What had struck me, and I don't have time to go into details, but what struck me was that some might think that your presentation and my presentations were completely at loggerheads and, just would not end up. And that only proves how complex a figure Chesnutt was.
Yes.
And I'm going to stop talking now, just thanking everybody for your presentation tonight.
And Professor James.
Yeah, so I appreciate the opportunity to share this, especially it's been a little while that it's been difficult to gain interest, especially in the tour, which I mean, really, I only did it out of my own kind of nerdy interest at first, but Fayetteville's a really fascinating city for a lot of different reasons, and this is just one of them. But I think Chesnutt is really important, especially right now, just as far as his struggle with identity and with where he fits in the world at the confluence of all of those different identities. But I appreciate the opportunity to share this evening.
And it's something that struck out to me, a couple of things, just a couple of closing thoughts for everyone. First, just thank you to all of the panelists. I think this is one of the real benefits of bringing all these different disciplines together: philosophy and history and literature and even geography in the sense of place. And, in our current local politics in Fayetteville, we have a lot of discussion about how to keep our own Charles Chesnutts here, our own bright students. How do we enable them to have a life that they can build here in town? And so that was something that jumped out to me from the presentations tonight, as well as these larger questions of identity and belonging and what it means to create a multiracial democracy where we can celebrate who we are while also, working together for a stronger, better community. And I encourage all of you who have not been involved in Lafayette Society to get involved in Lafayette Society. I also encourage you to take classes at FTCC and Fayetteville State and Methodist. And I know certainly at Fayetteville State, you can come as a special visiting student. Hank has taken a couple classes from me through the years, and it's always just really a delight to build these town gown partnerships. And that's what our colleges and universities are here for, is to build a more robust region where we can all be lifelong learners together. So thank you all for being a part of this. Check out the walking tour, check out the books, read books. It's great. And yeah, be safe, everyone. Have a good evening.